Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks for holding this hearing. It's pretty clear from some of the discussion and testimony this morning that you've got a tax credit that small businesses were probably primarily hoping to take advantage of, and it's obviously the folks that are taking advantage of it or using it is substantially lower or significantly lower, surprisingly lower than was ever expected, about 8% of those that are eligible. I know we're going to hear from some folks in the next panel that will be able to talk a little bit about why that might be the case, but I want to dive a little bit deeper, and I assume a lot of it is about the complexity. But I do want to follow up a little bit and ask this question, because it does seem that it's the burden perspective that is one of the reasons why companies are not participating in it. And I remember I spoke to one small manufacturing company in my district about health care in particular, and to its credit, this company does provide health insurance for its employees. And like many companies, this company is seeing its health insurance rates go up. But I think the reaction that I heard from the leaders that I talked to at the company when they say, look, we're covering our health care costs, we wish Congress would address the cost issue, but we're not going to participate in any of the potential benefits in the new health care law because we're not convinced it's worth the time and the effort to participate in these potential benefits. And so, I mean, that's of concern. I think it adds to the whole factor of uncertainty of how companies are investing in their people and in their equipment in the down economy. But let me do this. Let me ask this question, because we talked a little bit about fraud and accuracy. I want to dive a little bit deeper. Mr. George, in the report on the IRS efforts to implement the small business tax credit, you discussed the problems with tracking employees when employers are using these professional employer organizations. Can you explain a little bit about exactly what the problem is in regard to the credit and how the IRS can fix the problem for when these organizations are actually used?
Yes. One of the points that I raised earlier was simply having the IRS have the ability to cross-check the employee identification number between the professional, the PEO, the professional employer organization, and the entity with which they're representing. Now, I don't know whether or not the Commissioner thinks that the IRS needs legislation in order to accomplish that. But again, we recommended that over 2 years ago in a report that related to this. Going back to your point about complexity, sir, I mean, what we have found in our study of this matter, the taxpayer, in order to take advantage of this, has to determine which employees may be counted for credit purposes, what constitutes a qualifying arrangement, determining the number of FTEs for the purposes of the credit, determining the average annual wages for purposes of the credit, the premium payments for purposes of the credit are capped, so they have to make sure that they don't exceed that, the phasing out of the credit if the number of FTEs exceeds 10 and the average amount of wages exceeds $25,000, as you pointed out, and then the effect that state and local credits has on the overall issue. I mean, that is a factor that needs to be taken into consideration. So I know this is an extraordinarily difficult credit to implement. Very few people would be able to do it without the help of professional preparers. But I'll again yield to the Commissioner.
Well, and let me do this, because it sounds like, okay, there is complexity, obviously, but if the math is correct on the form, the company could be complying from the math perspective, but there could be erroneous, not fraud potentially, but erroneous reporting based on these professional service organizations that may be employing the individuals rather than the true small business. And so, I mean, how do you get away with doing an actual audit? You know, Commissioner Ingram, how do you get away from doing an actual audit? Does the IRS plan to audit more companies, more businesses, and in particular now that tax-exempt entities are eligible for this credit taken against income, which has not been a practice in the past, what I understand, with other credits? I mean, does the IRS plan to audit and increase audits for tax-exempt entities?
Well, one of the interesting things on the tax-exempt entity side is because that's a refundable credit and we have additional filters involved, we've been very interested in what kinds of folks are getting kicked out by those filters. And so learning from the profile, the demographics of which organizations seem to be hitting filters on that side has been important for us to monitor and to figure out how to tweak or cross-check those filters to make sure that we're getting the folks who do appear to have a reason that we should correspond with them prior to payment, and those which are getting caught up and which we could resolve without contact. a good example would be is if you were going to check certain databases about an exempt organization, you might find that a church that has no requirement to apply to be exempt, nor a requirement under the statute to file an annual return, might get kicked out, and yet is filing an employment tax return and has the right range of employees and wages. So that's a good example of kickouts where we want to look at what's getting kicked out and make sure that we're calibrating it to fit what really needs to be pursued.
And Commissioner, I know my time is just out, but can you just tell me, so does the IRS intend to do increased audits of tax-exempt entities as a part of this now?
If a tax-exempt entity has claimed a credit that we can't be comfortable with, we will correspond with them prior to payment.